Hello, I'm Andrew Susskind, and I'm a psychotherapist and author based on the west side of Los Angeles since 1992, specializing in trauma and addictive compulsive behaviors. Welcome to my podcast, named after my recent book and workbook, It's Not About the Sex. Here we have direct and honest conversations related to compulsive sexual behavior and trauma, all from a sexual health perspective. Our intention is to offer fresh viewpoints and practical strategies toward establishing greater intimacy and a more deeply connected life. Let's begin. Chapter 8, Restoring Purpose. I believe I was put on this planet to help others. Not only helping others heal their past, but also finding a future that matters to them. I realized this as a young child as I unconsciously assumed the role of arbitrator in my family, as well as the counselor to neighborhood moms, teachers, and even crossing guards. When someone asks me when I knew I wanted to be a therapist, I jokingly say, in utero. But actually, there is truth to it. Born into my chaotic family and falling into the role of a parentified kid, it was truly my destiny, and it took time to integrate my native talents into a meaningful career. The exploration of purpose was introduced to me by my coach Sam in 2001, as I grappled with the career direction at the time. In its simplest form, purpose is based on your core values, which are based on what matters most to you. Nowadays, I understand that my superpower is helping others to feel heard, understood, and seen, and my grandmother planted the original seeds. Whenever I spent time with my grandma, I felt deeply loved and lovable, and I try to pay it forward and spread the love wherever I go. Building better boundaries has always been one of my biggest challenges, as I need to pay attention to my emotional limits. Saying no still isn't easy, but I try to be clear with myself and others by saying no when I need to say no. Yet, I still feel guilty at times, which is a lasting echo of my past. I wish I could say that every day I stick to my purpose, but instead, it's an intention that I hold firmly.
I love that story. Can you say a little bit more about how you define purpose?
Well, before I talk more about purpose, let me start off by talking about spirituality, because I think they go together so beautifully.
Hmm.
Many years ago, I went to a presentation at UCLA given by a chaplain who was talking about spirituality and addictions. And the one piece of that particular workshop that stayed with me was his definition of spirituality, which is whatever gives your life purpose. I'll say that again. Whatever gives your life purpose.
So it's a spiritual quest for you then.
It is, and I know that not everyone resonates with the word spiritual or spirituality, but for a moment, let's just talk about the 12 steps as an
Hmm.
example.
Okay.
So the 12 steps, by definition, they're a spiritual program, not supposed to be religious necessarily, but spiritual. And the quest for purpose is part of that spirituality, right? So in the 12-step process, hopefully there's a soul searching along the way, somewhere along the way, that has to do with what gives my life purpose, what gives my recovery purpose. To speak for myself, purpose has always been about relationships. From the time I was little, my refuge always seemed to be with my search for love. As you know, I sometimes call it a heat-seeking missile. Nowadays, I do my best to try and give back what I've been given, and that's part of my purpose.
Okay, that's interesting because I think people sometimes try to find a purpose in a small specific thing, but you're talking more of like relationships as a purpose and connections and that's I love that you present it that way. That just makes more sense. than to try to pick like one thing. Like my purpose is to, people grapple with that question all the time.
And by the way, this revelation or this clarification for myself took many years. I used to look actually at bigger possibilities of what purpose meant. And I think sometimes it's a trap to look for something too big
Hmm.
and sometimes to look for something too small,
Right.
right?
Yeah. Yeah.
So really asking yourself the question, what matters most to you,
Yes. That's a great
right?
way to phrase it and to think about it. Yeah.
Yeah. And really, like we said in the workbook a moment ago, what matters most to us is really the signpost for what our core values are really about.
Right. And then defining what your core values are is probably the first step in this.
Yeah, yeah. And it's not meant to be technical. It's meant to be more of a free association. Like asking yourself, for instance, um, we could just do two or three, Sue, but what matters most to you, Sue?
I would say like honesty, accountability. I mean, outside of that, like physically my children and my relationships with others, but what they bring to it, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
So the idea, if we were to do this whole exercise, would be what matters most to you? What matters most to you? What matters most to you? I would be like a broken record, and you would come up with maybe 10 or 15 different things. And it's almost like a wringing of a wet towel, right? To really just let it rip and come up with as many things that matter to you,
Hmm.
and then start to look at what each one really means, right? And how does that take shape? And that's part of how we can get a better sense of what purpose really is to us.
You mentioned relationships, and I'm just thinking, like, what kind of relationships are you referring to?
Well, it really has been a long road, and I'll start by saying friends in my neighborhood for sure.
Hmm.
Sometimes parents of friends in my neighborhood who adopted me as a kid, many for many different families. Some of my teachers who really connected with me and knew that I was having a tough time at home and helped me through that and talked with me about that. Eventually mentors professionally and of course sponsors, coaches, and therapists. I've really been super, super fortunate to have
Hmm.
fantastic people as guides in my life. And you know, Sue, um, that relationships for me, and I want to clarify, emotionally reliable relationships, right? We've talked about how relationships in general can be fine,
Hmm.
but I don't believe in numbers, right? I believe in quality. And so, seeking those relationships, cultivating those relationships is part of what gives me purpose, both personally and professionally.
Okay. How does spirituality, purpose, and religion all intersect with each other?
They sometimes do and they sometimes don't. But I will share briefly where I come from on that. I grew up in a liberal Jewish home, and I grew up in a fairly liberal community around me. And as a young man, or a young boy, I was always told that there's more questions than there are answers. And I really like that. I've always liked that there is no dogma, there's no specific answers really when it comes to the bigger questions of life. And that part of the energy behind purpose and meaning and spirituality really is about asking questions, right? So that's where I come from. How about you, Sue? What does spirituality, religion, and purpose mean to you?
Well, I grew up in, I guess, a Catholic household, and went through the after school CCD program.
Right.
But growing up Catholic is more like following rules and not like necessarily rules of God, but rules of the religion. Um, and is interesting because my mom was raised by a Methodist, and I don't know, we weren't really religious. And I think she liked the history and the stories in the Bible and was able to relate those to um very progressively, to things that we may be going through ourselves. So we would read the stories of the Bible not as a religious type of thing, but more as a historic book,
Mm,
which
hmm.
was really interesting. But yeah, I drifted away from that religion and found more connection spiritually, just in energy work and feeling being connected at a somehow like different universal power or energy, you might say.
Hmm. Hmm.
And that really does align with my purpose of connection with you as well, because I really feel like we are connected at a more universal type of experience other than like the religion, right? That and those rules, which I do respect and understand and love that people find community in that. And I'm away from that actually. I don't go to church or partake in any religion, but I liked the foundation of it. I liked hearing the stories of it, and it did help me connect more with other people.
Hmm.
That's kind of the background of where I came from and how I view it now. It's just more of a universal energy.
Yeah. I I also hear as I'm talking, as you're talking, that there's no cookie cutter answers here.
Hmm,
And that if someone has a particular religious background that's meaningful to them today, exploring their spirituality, exploring their purpose is another layer. It's not one or the other. And if someone doesn't have a particular religious affiliation, also exploring purpose and spirituality, being curious, being open-hearted, and seeing what might be available, right?
exactly. Yeah.
Ultimately, it's really about soul searching, right? And
Yep.
and listening to a deeper part of ourselves. Positive psychologists sometimes talk about a reason to wake up in the morning, a reason to wake up in the morning. And I love that expression
Hmm.
because when we have a reason to wake up in the morning, it already tells us that we have purpose, we have trajectory, we have reason and something that propels us to live our lives, right?
Exactly.
And if we're lucky enough, our work, our career can be an extension of our purpose, or it can be congruent with our purpose. I've always been really blessed that for most of my career, it's really been right in sync with what my purpose is about. And
Hmm.
and this has been a lifelong unfolding. This was not something that I knew 30, 40 years ago when we first met.
You also talk about legacy in the workbook. And can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Legacy is a big word, first of
Hmm.
all. It sometimes can be a scary word for me, for you, for our readers, our listeners. But if we want to open the aperture just a bit more, we can talk about what legacy really means to you. And again, there's not one answer about what legacy really is. But to me, legacy is really about how we will be remembered,
Hmm.
right? How we will be remembered. And a lot of folks in our culture shy away from talking about death, shy away from talking about legacy or even anything that has to do with what happens after we die. I'm really interested in having that honest conversation with myself and with people that I care for. So I don't know about you, Sue, but did you happen to see the animated movie Coco?
Oh, I did. Yes. It was a great
And
movie.
yeah.
Well, I think in Coco, he wanted to play music, right? That was the big thing, if I'm remembering correctly. And then his family wasn't very supportive of that. And then once he um, figures out what his family wanted for him and what their legacy was, it all came together for him.
Hmm. Hmm.
Um, yeah, I mean, I, I really did love that movie. I love the music. I love how it was portrayed. I think having a musical background and we were able to connect with that probably a little deeper too. But legacy is interesting because I was thinking about this earlier this morning. I was listening to a radio show and they were talking about how people's legacies have changed recently as far as a lot of people not having children. And it's becoming more and more common. And that the boomers are upset that they're not having grandchildren, right?
Hmm.
And they're just it's not affordable, and for whatever reason people aren't having kids. So it
Hmm.
started me to think about like what is my legacy, and is it like, do I think of it going up like to my parents and my grandparents, or do I think of it trickling down to my kids and their lives? Like, when you think of legacy, do you think of it going back? Like, are you carrying your family traditions forward?
Hmm.
Or are you starting new traditions and hope that they move forward? And is that what you want to be remembered for? So I've just been thinking, I don't have the answer to that, but that legacy, unless it's very clear in your family with traditions and cultures, I think in Coco is like a cultural, traditional type thing paying
Hmm.
forward. I feel like it's kind of lost nowadays.
Hmm.
Cultures are not and tradition. I know we have our own traditions, and we're lucky
Hmm.
that we do have that. But
Hmm.
yeah, it's an interesting thing to think about, which I haven't really spent a lot of time doing.
I'm so glad you mentioned this idea of does it go back up through the generations, or is it about leaving something to the generations who are still going to be around? I sometimes talk about actually breaking the family legacy. And what I mean by that is that emotionally, I believe that you and I, hopefully our listeners as well, can create a more emotionally progressive life than our parents did. That oftentimes our parents and our grandparents, they just didn't have the language, they weren't socialized that way. It wasn't part of their particular generation, and we get to do it differently. And I know that my parents would want that for me, that they would want me to have a different experience and a more full life in a way than what they did in order to survive, really.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think that's what's as a parent, I feel like I want my children to feel that,
Hmm.
and have the options to progress and change and what is good for them.
Hmm. Hmm.
But yeah, I think looking back, there was a couple generations where it's you're right, they didn't have the language or the skills or the know-how to kind of progress and move
Right.
forward. They were just kind of stuck.
Right. And if we were to make an assumption, and it's not every family, but we know nowadays that there's intergenerational trauma.
Hmm.
And so I call it intergenerational hand-me-downs,
Hmm.
where our parents, our grandparents, our great-grandparents,
Sure.
they went through a lot of experiences and events that were just way too much to process at the time, which is one way of looking at trauma. And so, again, hopefully with each generation, we can have a different experience and hopefully a more love, more nurturance, more fullness of what life has to offer. And going back to Coco for a second, because Coco was a very touching movie for me, it really focused on the themes between the grandparents and the grandchildren and the opposite of intergenerational trauma, which is intergenerational gifts of
Mm.
love,
Hmm.
which may be one of our greatest purposes of all. And Coco was based in the Mexican culture, and the
Right.
Mexican culture oftentimes surpasses American culture because they really have a different relationship with death. I mean, like Dia de los Muertos, they really honor death and honor
Hmm.
those who have died, and there's something very refreshing about that.
Yeah, it's interesting. And every culture has a different way of looking at death. I read the
Yeah.
Taoist book of death, and how in China they respect their elders a lot differently than we do. It's interesting, but I do see that there's a lot of change coming, and good for Disney for putting this out and
Oh my gosh,
sharing this culture.
it was so beautiful. And the other thing I just want to say about legacy is that it is an unfolding, meaning that this it's not a finite kind of specificity, right? It's something that we get to mull over and digest and consider and be curious about and just notice what legacy really means to us. I know that today, Sue, at this point in my life, is very different than it was 15, 20 years ago, for sure. And
Mhm.
I don't have kids, as you know. I've been fortunate, though, to have a lot of folks in my practice and associates and interns and people that I have been touched by, and hopefully I've been able to touch. And
Mhm.
it's not like raising a kid, but it is a version of legacy. So legacy takes a lot of different shapes and forms.
Absolutely. And your books will be around forever and ever and ever.
We'll see about
And
that.
these podcasts go on forever and ever.
Exactly. That's right. That's right.
They're always going to hear our voices no matter what.
That's great. So, why don't we do this? Why don't we share, as we've been doing, this section at the end of the chapter called Your Practice, and that will close our episode. Okay, so at the end of our chapter on restoring purpose is your practice. Number one, ask yourself what gives your life meaning. This will reveal your current version of spirituality. Allow your investigation to change over time.
Being of service is a foundational way of creating purpose in your life. Take a look at how you are being other centered and enjoy the generosity within yourself.
Number three, consider all of the possible ways to create meaning in your life. You will find a reason to wake up in the morning when it's not all about you.
Number four, consider collaborating with a coach or a trusted confidant as you move toward your bigger intentions.
And number five, knowing that these concepts can be amorphous, stay open-minded to the endless possibilities in front of you. Thanks for listening today. It was so terrific sharing the time with my colleague and close friend, Sue Merlino, and discussing this really meaningful topic. If you're so inclined, please give us a 5-star rating and be sure to subscribe and share my podcast with those who may benefit. I look forward to you joining us the next time, and don't forget to stay connected.